All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Living Earth Collaborative and the EEPB seminar this week. My name is Kara. I'm one of the LAC postdocs. I'm really thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jason Knouft. Jason is a professor in the biology department of St. Louis University, as well as a large river ecologist with the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. In 2021, Jason was awarded a Jefferson Science Fellowship, where he served as an intelligence research specialist with the U.S. Department of State. And they were so impressed with Jason that they kept him on as an expert consultant in water and climate security. In addition to an impressive publication and funding record, Jason is a really wonderful and generous mentor, which I can personally speak to. I did my master's with Jason in 2017, and now I'm back co-advised by Jason as an LAC postdoc. Today, Jason will be talking to us about the potential for the weaponization of water in a changing climate. So please join me in welcoming Jason.
All right. Yeah. Did that work? I've got like 3 screens up here now. Okay, good. All good?
Yeah.
All right, great.
Okay, it's still sharing with the on. It looks like.
Is that my fault?
My fault.
All right.
I think we just need to go into the actual slideshow. Maybe not. Slideshow. I don't know how to, I'm not a PC. Can we minimize the?
Man, my cursor disappeared.
It's on the screen.
Oh,
So we can...
about that.
Yep. And then go back to PowerPoint and share.
But if it's stop share.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And then go to
Slideshow.
we practice this, I swear.
Oh wait, let's try this. Here, let me just shut everything down and see what happens. Should I do this one?
No, we want to share PowerPoint. I just don't think it's open yet.
Right.
When you pull that fully up into presenter. Okay, and now share your screen through Zoom.
Where do you think I should do?
Oh, I'm giving stuff away.
That's right.
Let's just try that. Nope.
Yeah, it just gives out a little.
Yeah. Hey. Stop share. Hmm. No, it doesn't help that I'm a Mac person and I'm totally confused by
Can you
this.
try it from slideshare instead of- go to slideshow at the top.
Oh, up here
Where is it?
from.
So that's right on this one there.
Mhm.
Can you share?
There we go, or screen two. We can do that.
We are in.
All right, nice.
Hurdle one cleared.
Great job, everyone. Outstanding work. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Kara. I'm thrilled you're back as well. Yeah, it's truly great having Kara back, and I'm just thrilled about it. I'm also happy to be here today. I appreciate everybody coming out. So what I want to talk about today is, as Kara mentioned, for the past year, I was a climate and water security analyst in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department during a Jefferson Science Fellowship. And so it really very much changed my perspective on my research and how I view environmental systems. And so I want to give an overview of that today and sort of the perspective. So this is more a kind of an overview of the idea of the weaponization of water as opposed to a research talk. And part of that is just, it's really, I hope to give you a different perspective on environmental systems that I think than we usually come at as ecologists or evolutionary biologists. So much of my work before going to the State Department dealt with the impacts of climate and land use change on freshwater systems, so hydrology and ecosystems and that kind of stuff. And so what I'm going to talk about now is more focusing on how water security translates to national security and how we need to be thinking about sort of the implications of changing water security in the coming decades, particularly in the context of national security. The other part of it too is I think it's really a nice opportunity to expose graduate students and potentially postdocs to other things you can do with your PhD. So when I was a graduate student, I never really knew anything other than going into a faculty position. So if you have any questions about the program I was in, please let me know. I have to actually leave right after this to run the soccer shuttle for my kids, but send me an email. But whoops. There we go. Yeah, so the fellowship I had is this Jefferson Science Fellowship, and it's administered by the National Academies of Sciences and supported by the Department of State and USAID. And so the idea is it's a way to engage American academics in foreign policy and international development. And so basically faculty members get a better understanding of the federal government, and these federal agencies get the benefit of scientific expertise. And it's extremely analogous to the AAAS fellowship, which you may be aware of. And so the AAAS fellowship is sort of for more junior people, and the Jefferson Science Fellowship is for more senior people. And in fact, Jefferson Science Fellows and AAAS Fellows will often interview for the same position. And so it's a bit like the skill sets are very similar and the experiences tend to be very similar. So, even as I got to the Department of State, I didn't really understand how it worked. So I just want to give you a bit of an overview of that. So the goal of the State Department, so the State Department is the base of international diplomacy for the US government. And so the goal of the State Department is to protect and promote US security, prosperity, and democratic values. So the mission of the State Department translates into preserving democracy around the world and expanding economic opportunities for US businesses. I mean, when you cut it down to the bare bones, those are the two things driving federal diplomacy. So I was within the State Department. I think many people think of the State Department as the main international policy wing of the federal government, but there's also an intelligence component to the State Department. And so I was in the intelligence wing of the State Department, which is the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And so it's actually the oldest civilian intelligence agency in the US. So there's a long history, which is referred to as INR, long history for INR. And within that, I was in the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues. And so our job in the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues was essentially to deal with transboundary issues around the world. And so there are many offices at the State Department. They're either functional offices, meaning like economics, cyber, that kind of stuff, or regional offices. And so if you were in one of those, like the regional office would be like Southeast Asia. So if you were in one of those offices, you had a very clear directive. But in the Office of the Geographer, we were transboundary, so we pretty much covered everything that crossed a border. And so most everything crossed a border, so we were focused on a lot of different issues. And so I was the water and climate security analyst in what's referred to as GGI, but we had, people dealing with genocide, we had human trafficking, disease. I mean, it was just covering the whole array of issues that we would collect intelligence on. It's also the home of the geographer of the United States, referred to as GOTUS. I don't know if any of you knew that there was a GOTUS, but GOTUS is actually a very important person, and I won't get into why, but just know that GOTUS is there if you need him. And so just to give you a perspective of the US intelligence community. So I was an analyst, which meant I had top secret security clearance. And there are 17 different agencies in the US intelligence community, and the Department of State is just one of them, okay? And so they refer to this as the Wheel of Seals, and these are all the different intelligence agencies. And April Haynes is the Director of National Intelligence. So she is the one that oversees all of the different intelligence agencies. So she's referred to as DNI Haynes. DNI Haynes is a very, very important person. Anyway, and I only put this up to give you an idea of what the State Department looks like. So these are all the functional and regional policy offices. And then INR is here, which is where I was. And each of these functional offices and regional offices had a paired office in intelligence and research. And we would do the analysis and they would do the policy. And I would never comment on policy as an analyst, and they called it crossing the red line and you could get fired. And so the idea is you never want that conflict of interest between an analyst and a policymaker. So I would work with the policymakers to figure out what they needed to know, but I would never write anything that implied policy. Okay, so with all that said, what I was dealing with as an analyst was climate and water security. And so because of my background, I tended to lean more toward water security in the work I was doing. And frankly, climate is it's not something you can like pin down. Like water security you can pin down, but climate is just sort of this umbrella over a bunch of other things. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the perspectives I got in this position. First off, just talk to you about climate change and water security and what I mean by that. And so first, just to take a look and think about the hydrologic cycle. So I heard this quote from Peter Gleick, who's a well-known hydrologist, and I just really liked it. And the comment is, the amount of water on the planet is stable, but the frequency of the three forms varies based on climate. So solid, liquid, gas. And as climate is changing, the compartments, the amount of liquid or the amount of water in each of these three compartments is changing, right? And so that's the problem that we're having right now, is that the hydrologic cycle is speeding up in some ways, and water is being held in different compartments. And so we're getting intense rainfall events, we're getting floods, we're getting prolonged droughts. And this has implications to water security, okay? And as climate is changing, it's altering, this trajectory is changing as well. So we're no longer in this static climate or the stationary climate. And so as we think about water security and we think about the hydrologic cycle, we need to start thinking about it in a fundamentally different way than we have before the climate started changing. And so that's one of the challenges that I think we're facing in terms of water security, and one of the things that I've tried to convey in this role as an analyst. So there's a lot of text, but I think it's worth reading. There are a lot of definitions of water security, but this is from the UN, and it's the capacity of a population to safeguard sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality water for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, and socioeconomic development, protecting against pollution, water-related disasters, and preserving ecosystem in a climate of peace and political stability. And so the idea is, from a national security perspective, we want to have enough water to maintain political stability, okay? And maintaining that political stability requires that you provide people with the necessary amount of water to carry out their business. So in the next few years, by 2025, the UN forecasts that 1.8 billion people will be living in areas of water stress or water scarcity, sorry. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But so let's talk just a little bit about how water security is tied to national security and make that link. So when water resources are not secure, social stability decreases, people tend to lose faith in the government and become disengaged in democratic processes. And so what happens is water is fundamentally important to us, right? And so, we turn on our faucet, water comes out, like you don't even think about it. It's one of the most basic necessities of life, and I would argue the most basic necessity of life. And so if you don't get that, basically what happens is the social system or the community population starts losing trust in the government, because the sort of the path is that you think like, well, this is the most basic thing I need. And if the government can't give me the most basic thing I need, I can't trust it to do anything else. And so then people there's either translates to violence, or it translates to people becoming disengaged in democracies or in the democratic process. And so the issue there is that, the US on the international landscape wants to maintain water security throughout the world, because if we maintain water security, it maintains democracy. Okay, so that's the connection between water security and national security, because ultimately the support of democracy comes back to us and supports our own internal national security. So, and then just to build on this, once national security starts to crumble, then water security becomes even more impacted because infrastructure isn't maintained, and then it's sort of this ongoing cycle. So it becomes a real problem. Okay, so just to give you an idea, so we've got climate security at the core of all this. Climate, directly influences water security, and water influences energy. We can talk about general environmental security, we've got food security, we've got human health. All these different issues are tied together. And so, it's a fairly complicated system. And once any one of these components starts breaking down, it leads to social instability, political instability, and then there's the national security link. So just to kind of hammer that home. So as a water security analyst, I dealt with all of these issues. So I would do analyses on disease outbreaks, energy systems, food systems, just straight up water. But it sort of gives you an idea of the systems perspective that the federal government's dealing with when they think about these environmental situations related to national security. So there is a resource called Aqueduct, the Water Risk Atlas by the World Resources Institute. And they keep updating areas of water stress and risk. And so I only put this up here just so you get an idea of sort of the lay of the land. The red areas this is water stress. And so these are areas where we just don't have much water. This was, I pulled this map back in September. This is overall water risk. So this takes into account water stress, but also infrastructure, right? So you can see in Africa, you don't have a whole lot of water stress at this point, but the water risk is still very high because the infrastructure doesn't support the people as well as it could. Anyway, so what happens when we get these water disruptions? And so this is just in the past year, the past couple of years. The Paraná River in South America, this is July 2019, July 2020. This is the decrease because of drought. So there's a huge soybean export coming from this region. So there's a supply chain issue that's impacting global food prices. The Danube River was drying up in 2022. This also impacted the war in Ukraine because there was significant transport coming out of Ukraine because the marine ports were cut off by the Russians. And so there's this knock-on effect to wheat transport coming out of Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the top wheat exporters in the world, like 2 or 3. So that's the implication there. The Yangtze River in China, this was last August. There were huge droughts. It cut off. The droughts were so significant that the Yangtze was low enough that they had to shut down their hydropower plants and consequently shut down entire cities. And it shut down the Volkswagen plant, the Tesla plant, a whole bunch of automotive part plants, which then disrupted global supply chains for automakers, right? And so it's a very specific example, but it gives you some perspective that, it's not just our tap, it's food, it's water, or it's food, it's energy, it's industry. And then of course we had the Mississippi this past fall that got, in some parts the lowest recorded levels. And, at one point there were like 1,700 barges stranded down in New Orleans. And the cost of moving grain from Iowa, St. Louis down to New Orleans over tripled during that time period. Okay, so it's all, just to give you the impression, like all these water issues have a much broader impact on sort of our day-to-day business. So we come back to this idea of water security, but we're dealing with it now in a changing climate. And so, for up till say 1970 or whatever, the climate was stationary, right? And so our social systems have, I don't want to throw around the word evolved here too loosely, but they've evolved, for spring rains, knowing when, agricultural seasons could start and that kind of stuff. And so we could predict each year based on the past, but now that we're in a non-stationary climate, it's becoming much more difficult to use past events to project future climate. And so that can be explicit, like whether or not we're thinking about planting crops, or it can be sort of this implicit, notion of water security, in that I don't know when it's going to flood. I don't know when we're going to have a drought. And it creates sort of this sense of anxiety, which has implications. So, water supplies are going to become less predictable, or now they are less predictable due to climate variability. So the thing that I'm really thinking about and maybe worried about, depending on the day, is our perceptions of water security also becoming non-stationary, right? So do how people think about water, and when I say people, I mean either, nation states or groups within countries, are their responses to the notion of water conservation or water sharing or water diplomacy changing? So when we've got this uncertainty, there's really reduced time for consideration of options, right? So if you all of a sudden have a flood or a drought that you didn't expect, it's very difficult to, it's more difficult to respond. And the response tends to be less informed and more reactionary, and it results in the depletion of resources. Because what happens is, effectively, like, people panic and try and use, as much resources as they can. So that, and this is all model based, right? So these are sort of, we'll say, predictions or projections. But the problem then is conflict becomes problematic and more widespread when the sort of these mechanisms for management and resolution break down. And this really happens in the context of transboundary systems. And so this comes back to what we were working on in the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues. And so these blue polygons are transboundary river basins. And so these are places where countries are sharing water. And there's an upstream country and there's a downstream country. And you can imagine this becomes an issue. There's also transboundary aquifers. And so our groundwater is important as our surface water, and we're also sharing groundwater across many countries. And so we're dealing with these types of issues. So what then happens? And so one of the concerns now is the frequency of the weaponization of water is increasing. So what does that mean? What is the weaponization of water? And when does it happen? So it happens when there's existing animosities, there's a variable environmental conditions, the societal institutions are not strong, and there's infrastructure development that benefits one country over another. So you can imagine a dam being built in the upstream country versus the downstream country, which is a major issue. But these can be both subnational and transboundary. So this could be between Ethiopia and Egypt, or it could be between Colorado and Arizona, right? So how does it become a weapon? So we can have strategic weaponization. So it's used to control areas, tactical weaponization, where the water is actually used to target a military operation, or coercive weaponization. And so it's just there's different ways that water can be moved. And so, we think about we're possibly damaging infrastructure, again, the military targets, but then you get like these psychological issues related to water, which I'm going to come back to towards the end of the talk. And then there's also these political issues that I'll also talk about in a few minutes. Okay, so what are examples of conflict? So if anybody has free time and interested, the Pacific Institute maintains a water conflict map that has the history of conflict, and it goes back quite a ways. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Lagash-Uma border dispute, and that was quite a while ago. And the king of Lagash diverted water from Uma, and so basically caused a person-made drought in the region. Peloponnesian War, the Spartans poisoned cisterns in Piraeus. The Dutch intentionally flooded land around Alkmaar to break the siege of Spanish troops. This is called the Dutch waterline approach. And so this is something that this is a sort of a tactical terminology now. China flooded the Yellow River to defend against Japanese troops, 1938. And then most recently, Ukraine released water from a dam on the Dnipro River to slow Russian troops, and it was actually very effective. Anyway, so those are sort of historical examples. If you want to get into more specific, there's quite a bit of water conflict between Syria and Iraq right now, and so you can just sort of see that. So this is from Marcus King, and he does a lot of work in the region. He's at Georgetown, but you can see that there are particular incidents, I don't know, 30 or 40 individual instances of weaponization of water between Syria and Iraq. And I think this is over the past 10 years. So it's not, so the idea of weaponization is not uncommon. But so as we're looking forward and we're thinking about these transboundary aquifers, how do we deal with this? How do we start predicting where we might see weaponization occur or where we might see conflict over water? And so this is a map of water stress based on the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. So this SPEI basically is a statistic that incorporates how much rain is coming down and how much water is coming off. So the red areas are water stress, the green areas are not. And this is data put together by a postdoc in my lab, Ali Hassan Shapir. So we're starting to work on these issues. But if you look at the transboundary aquifers in the region, it can allow you to start focusing on these different regions. And so, me looking at this map with some background on this, I would say like, well, Egypt and Libya is something that we need to be thinking about because, it's water stress, they're sharing an aquifer. There's a lot going on in those two countries in a variety of different ways that imply that this is an issue. So with this idea of climate security in a non-stationary world, we're getting towards this idea of water conflict becoming more prevalent. And so we need to think about the idea, and this is largely being manifested because of hydrohegemony. And this is where an upstream country builds a dam and controls the water going into the downstream country. And there may be agreements in place, but then as the climate changes, those agreements become less adhered to. So the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is the case that everybody in this sort of space thinks about. It's the real problem. But Ethiopia built a dam, and it's almost fully functional, and Egypt is quite concerned about this. This is not necessarily weaponization now, but it may be a source in the future. On the Tigris and Euphrates River, Turkey is putting severe constraints on the amount of water getting down into Syria. One of the major long-term issues is China's hydropower program on the Mekong River, as well as the fact that all of the major rivers in Southeast Asia originate on the Tibetan Plateau. And so there's great concern that as the ice melts, the snow melts in the Tibetan Plateau, that we're going to see China taking a more direct control of water resources across Southeast Asia, which is a very, from a national security perspective, maintaining a democratic Southeast Asia is incredibly important. And this is one of the major levers that people are very concerned about. So how does water become a weapon? It can be used to damage infrastructure, but it also can be used from this psychological perspective, which I want to start talking about now, and focusing on the US. In case you weren't concerned at this point, I'm going to try and bring this home to you and put it in your backyard. So anyway, if we come to this idea, when water resources are not secure, social stability decreases, people tend to lose faith in government and become disengaged from democratic processes. So this is a major, major concern right now. So in 2021, October of 2021, the FBI, National Security Agency, the NSA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the EPA warned that US water and wastewater systems are being targeted by known and unknown malicious actors. So this was, I didn't realize this when I read it, but this was apparently like a really big deal that they put this out, because there'd never been what they refer to as a multi-seal product related to US national security on environmental systems ever before. And all these different agencies felt it was important enough to come together and put this out. So a couple examples of where we've seen cyber threats to water security. And so I should take a step back. So when we're talking about cyber threats, this is where the cyber systems, the computer systems controlling the water infrastructure are hacked, taken over, and manipulated, okay? And so a couple of examples where this has already happened in the US, and it's happened multiple, like more than I'm going to show you. But there was a dam in Rybrook, New York, the Bowman Avenue Dam was targeted by Iranian hackers who gained control of dam operations, including the sluice gates, And the sluice gates are the things that come up and let all the water out. But just coincidentally, unfortunately, the sluice gates were offline at the time, so they weren't connected to the cyber systems. The thing that's more maybe interesting about this is they figured out who did it, and they also figured out, I mean, in the sense that it was the Iranians, but they also figured out that they weren't targeting this dam, they were targeting a much, much larger dam in Oregon, also called the Bauman Dam. And so this one, which is, yeah, it's kind of interesting. But you know, if this one had opened in New York, you know, there was like a community of a few thousand people there, which is obviously the problem. But the one in Oregon was hundreds of thousands of people would have been impacted by this dam release. So significant. In Oldsmar, Florida in 2021, a hacker attempted to raise the level of lye in the water more than 100-fold at the city's water treatment facility. And the only reason that people recognized this, or the only reason that this was caught, was because one of the site engineers was literally sitting looking at his monitor, and all of a sudden his cursor started moving back and forth across the monitor, and they shut everything down. But if they hadn't, it would have poisoned the water treatment. And if you're interested in this, I can give you more depth on why that's probably the last time cyber threat will make that mistake. And then we also have situations where water treatment facilities have been compromised in California, Maine, Nevada, and New Jersey. So it's fairly common. And the way this happens is so much of our industrial infrastructure is coordinated. There's a couple of different ways, but one of the primary ways are these supervisory control and data acquisition setups, which are referred to as SCADA. But basically, it's a computer-based control system that supervises everything: the sensors, the machines, the processes that all interface with industrial infrastructure. And so you can imagine, like, you've got you know, a computer center, coordinating computers, supervisory computers, all these different sort of points. And at any point, a hacker can basically hack into any one of these parts. And so all it takes is one person like clicking on a phishing email or not using two-factor authentication. Like before I went to the State Department, I was always like, I hate getting this code on my phone so I can get my email. I would do that 10 times if somebody asked me to do that now. Anyway, so basically what happens is they hack into these SCADA systems and gain control over the infrastructure. And the thing that's really concerning is that quite often the control is gained and then nothing is done. And so it's well known that a good chunk of US infrastructure related to water is probably already been hacked. And the problem is we don't know which ones have been hacked and which one, like whether or not people are sort of waiting for this or why they've been hacked and nothing has happened. And so, for example, like Oldsmar, Florida, was that somebody really trying to do something? You know, they had a plan and had something against Oldsmar, Florida, or were they just sort of seeing if they could do it? You know what I mean? And so that's the major issue that we're dealing with and trying to think about. And just to give you some perspective, there are about 1,600 wastewater treatment plants in the US, and each one of them is an individual system, right? And so these are not linked, these are not coordinated in any way. There's no sort of overarching cyber system controlling these wastewater plants. So each one of those plants is a target, and each one of, and the way I think about this in terms of national security, to bring it back there, is that each one of these plants provides an option for destabilization of the water system, and then sort of decreasing stability of local communities and causing disengagement of people from the democratic process. And so, I think about this in the context of, the larger picture of, why are we worried about water security? Well, we're worried about it obviously because we want our taps to turn on and give us water, but there's also this broader consideration of how it influences social stability. So we're also seeing this globally. So the US is not the only one dealing with this. In Israel in 2020, there were, and I should say this is all open source. None of this is classified. I just want to be clear about that. In Israel in 2020, pumping stations and treatment facilities were attacked with attempts to increase chlorine levels. In 2020, there was control over a recycled reservoir system. Norway's had problems with ransomware. In the UK, hackers gained systems or control of systems that control chemicals in the water. So the thing that is I think noteworthy about cyber threats to water is historically water has kind of been off limits in terms of tactical activities. That is, you really wouldn't attack a water system because usually you're on the same ground with that water, right? So, like Russia won't go into Ukraine and poison all the water because their soldiers need the water. But the problem with cyber threats is that you don't need to be physically engaged with that location to be dealing with, and so that sort of frees you up. And the other aspect of it too is that, we in the US, we've always been kind of isolated. So we've got two very large oceans on the sides of us that insulates us from, attacks on our infrastructure. But so that sort of has been, removed in terms of cyber threats. So these are kind of the things that we're thinking about. So beyond sort of this human consumption and sanitation, when we get these cyber disruptions, we're dealing with disruptions to transportation and supply chains, certainly power generation, industry. The tech industry is one of the largest users of water. And then certainly food security is directly tied to water security. So if we lose that water security, there's also implications to food security. So, just to bring it all back is that if we, disruption of any of these areas can have direct impacts on water, food, energy, social, and political stability. So, it comes back to this idea: if the government can't get something right, or can't get something simple, or something as basic as access to water right, society can't expect government to do anything right. And so this is one of the fundamental issues that people are considering when we're thinking about water security, particularly cybersecurity. And what that's translating to is sort of a more overarching approach to cybersecurity, both within the US and outside. So, yeah, and I have this quote, and this is, I'll be honest, this is from a different talk I gave, but I like having it in here. This book by Teodoro Zolfi and Switzer was basically focused on water security issues in disenfranchised communities. And they make this whole argument that people who drink bottled water are less engaged in government. And the reason for that is because they don't trust the water systems that they have, and they feel they have to pay more for something that they should be able to get out of their tap, right? So it's this whole complicated social system issue. Okay, so coming back to this idea of, well, I think that was just an extra slide I had in there. Anyway, so when we think about cyber threats to water security, it's this area that I think we really need to be concerned about. So, we're thinking about water security, we're thinking about the context of climate uncertainty, but then, we add in the cyber disruptions, and it really elevates the whole issue of how people interact with water and their confidence in water. And the way that people think about this is going to be changing over time. So we're all going to get, I think, more sensitive to the availability of water, depending on where we are. Okay, so, just to bring this all together, so what we're seeing now is not the new normal. And so sometimes, you'll hear people, have like a drought or a flood that's, caused by, unexpected weather or climate. And people say, well, this is the new normal. And it's not the new normal. Like next year is going to be different. Year after that's going to be different. Year after that's going to be different. Year after that's going to be different until we get our emissions under control. And the problem with this, beyond the immediate lack of, or the immediate uncertainty of our resources, is that it's going to influence human behavior. And so the way that we perceive the environment is also going to change, and the way that we respond to changes in environmental conditions is going to change. And so I think this is one of those things that, you know, people are thinking about, but I feel like it needs to be more in the forefront of how we manage and perceive our resources and our environmental security. You know, water is likely going to be, well, almost certainly going to become a common limiting factor in most of our systems. And the need for secure water supply, I think, is probably going to increase instances of weaponization. And so, you know, we need to start thinking about new approaches to water security, or new ways to think about managing and stabilizing water security. And so how do we do this? We need to focus more on the implications of the uncertainty of climate. And when I say we, I don't mean people in this room. I think people in this room understand the variability associated with climate change. But, you know, from a federal and policy perspective, that variability is not clearly understood. And we need to focus more on adaptation, resilience, and then diplomacy, and then awareness, and certainly awareness. And so that is, to me, this last part was one of the great benefits and opportunities I felt I had during the past year, is that as this analyst, in this analyst role, you know, I was the only water security analyst at the State Department. And so, and the only person with a hydrologic background. And so it allowed me to elevate the awareness of this issue at fairly high levels. So anyway, to finish up, I just want to acknowledge the folks in the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues, and then the Office of Science and the Technology Advisor at the State Department. National Academy supported the fellowship. SLU let me go for a year. And you know, maybe they were more than happy to do that, I don't know. And then these folks were all in the State Department office that I was in. And they, like, just as a side note, these are the most, like, the State Department people are the most committed, hardworking, smartest group of people I've ever worked with. And it was like, it was humbling and inspiring all at the same time to be there. And then Ali Hassan Shabir is a current postdoc in my lab who helped with some of those data analyses. So with that, I will take any questions.
Great. Yeah, we have time for questions, or any questions on Zoom, YouTube.
Okay, we have a question from John Birmingham Jr., who asks, what are your thoughts about the Colorado River Compact implications for Arizona and California of the Colorado River crisis?
I don't know. I'm not going to, like, no pun intended, wade into that right now. There are people with much deeper insights. The challenge out there is that I think people are not being realistic about, some people are not being realistic about how much water is available and how that water is being shared. And so, again, like, I'm not tracking this as closely as some other things, but, you know, like, what are you going to do? Either you handle it yourself, or the federal government at the federal level needs to come in, because there's simply not enough water. And there's no reason to believe that the amount of water available is going to increase anytime in the near future or the next 20 years. Yeah. Michael? Or, all right, sorry.
Don't you think in a way that having 1,600 separate municipal systems is an advantage? I mean, it does create a lot of point vulnerabilities, but on the other hand, there's no single system that can be hacked. And
yeah, it's a good point. There are pros and cons to it, but the cons are that they're all, not all of them, but many of them are understaffed and underfunded. And so the plus of having a uniform, and this is my opinion, the plus of having a uniform umbrella over it and uniform coordination is that it would cover the places that have nothing. And so, but to your point, like our energy systems are, we've lost the entire eastern seaboard to hacks to our energy system because it's on a coordinated network. So it's not necessarily that they need to be all linked, but they need to all have the same level of security. And so, yeah, I mean, that's more the way I would think about it.
Thanks, very interesting.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about what it means to not cross that red line.
Yeah.
And are there some guiding principles that you had to adhere to for that? I mean, as an analog, I'm thinking of journalistic integrity or scientific objectivity. What was your principles there?
It was, nobody ever told me how to do that, but it became pretty clear that if you simply just didn't make a recommendation on a policy. So I could say, this is happening, X, Y, and Z are happening now. It's happening because A, B, and C, and that's what I would say. I wouldn't say, and then I might say there is a strong likelihood of this happening or a high likelihood of this happening. But I could never say these are the implications of that happening. And so that is one of those things, like if you see it, you know it, and I mean, like looking at, I found it pretty easy once I sat down and started looking at policy versus non-policy, like analysis stuff. It was, the distinction to me was pretty clear. So yeah, it was actually very refreshing because like there was no discussion section of the manuscript, right? Yeah, it was just a very brief intro, methods and results. And I mean, it was really interesting. I mean, if I wrote something, the standard thing I would write would be, I think it was like 600 words. And so the way that we would write was so different, and it was so concise and to the point, and it was just a very different experience.
Okay, we have another YouTube question from Jeff Weiss, who asks, what has been done since the government's water security alert, and what do you think should be done?
So are they, I wonder if that person is referring to the Water Security Action Plan. So that, I'm just going to guess. So there's a global water security action plan, and there's the National Water Security Plan, or I can't remember the title of it. So what's been done? It's kind of a whole of government directive, meaning, that's put out and it's sort of guidelines. So to say what's been done, I mean, it's sort of, my sense is that when we're dealing with water issues, they should be, the way that those issues are addressed should fall under the directives of the Water Security Action Plan. And so what do I think should be done? That's an impossible question to answer. It's like, these are literally wicked problems where there is no good solution to most of these problems. So I think people should just keep working. That's what I think. That's what I think should be done. People are giving it, I was always in admiration of the honest and what I felt was like ethical effort that people were committing, to these issues. So, yeah.
Okay, now my own question. So one of the things that I've noticed, I'm a Californian, the Colorado River kind of drying up has really changed the Gulf of California and the salinity of the Gulf of California, because we're not getting that fresh water influx. And there's a ton of ecology that is changing because of that. There's been a lot of talk about the vaquita, this tiny little porpoise, and it's going to go extinct. And a lot of that has been blamed on fishermen, but I'm sure a huge portion of it is just the change in salinity that's occurred at that top of the Gulf.
Yeah.
And so I know a lot of your talk was focused on humans, but kind of, can you speak to the ecology of how these are, when we're drying up these water areas, when we're changing the flow rate of these dams, how is that impacting the ecosystem?
So, broadly impacting it. And it's, I mean, it really comes back to this whole issue of this being a system. And so, whether or not it's due to drought, it's due to, water behind hydropower dams, whether it's due to agriculture, we're fundamentally changing the hydrologic system, which is impacting ecosystems, and then our solutions are impacting them. So, desalination is needed desperately in many parts of the world. But when you desalinate water, it creates brine, and that gets dumped into the ocean, right? And that is doing effectively the same thing. So, what's it doing? It's disrupting ecosystems, but where that falls in the hierarchy of importance is a different question, and that's context dependent. Like if it's a fishery in Brazil that is important to indigenous people, that's important. That is something that will gain attention. If it's an impoundment that disrupts diversity in the Tennessee River, it's not going to get as much attention for various reasons. And, similarly, like an impoundment or a desal plant in Jordan is like, they need water, and so it's all this, it's like I said, it's a wicked problem, which is, wicked problem is something that really has no solution that will satisfy everyone. And so, to maybe put this in the room, the most important thing is informing, policy, if you will, with science. And so that, I think that is the most, that is critical. And the respect that, the people I worked with at the State Department had for the academic community was immense. And really looking for that level of expertise. But the distance between the academic community and the applied side or the policy side, it's not necessarily policy, but any application is so vast. And that is one of I think the major challenges that we as academics need to be more cooperative about, is bridging that divide. Howdy.
Thanks for the talk.
Mhm.
It's awesome.
Good.
I'm curious, you said that it's changed, like that experience has changed how you like your work.
Yeah.
Which aspect? How
So,
has it informed your work now?
yeah, so I'm much more interested in the systems perspective and how humans are impacted. And when I say how humans are impacted, I mean I used to make that statement in a very general way, but now I'm more interested in understanding how water stress or changes in climate are going to influence food production in the Horn of Africa, and how that's going to relate to food insecurity in that region, and maybe how that then translates to human migration across that region, or how changes in hydropower availability are going to influence just X, Y, and Z, so many different things. Yeah, so it's that I'm much more focused on the water side of it and the sort of the knock-on effects of water security or water insecurity.
Okay, we have one more question from Jonathan Lassos, who asks,
Let's just wrap this up.
I like this one.
Okay.
Are most Jefferson Fellows faculty members, and what happens after being a Jefferson Fellow? Do faculty return to their normal humdrum faculty lives?
So it depends on where you are. So yes, as far as I can tell, they're all faculty members. And it depends on where you are. So the office I was in, the head of my office, Godis, is really knows how to effectively use Jefferson Science Fellows. And the one before me said, who was at Michigan State, I was talking to him, he was kind of mentoring me. He was like, I can't go back. He's like, I can't go back to academia. And he didn't. And I like, frankly, I felt very similar. Like it was that impactful. But fortunately, for various reasons, I've been able to sort of dovetail the two now and keep, one foot in both places. A fellow before me in the office is still, she's deals with wildlife trafficking. She still is working with the State Department, but maintained her faculty position. But then there are other people that have very bad experiences and in fact, don't even finish the year out because of the office they're in. And so the people that I've known and been close with, it's like totally changed the way they do things. And so it's been very impactful. But then there are other people who are just kind of like, oh, yeah. But anyway, yeah. So it's like anything. It sort of depends on who you're working with and the job you have. Like I just got very lucky with who I was working with, and yeah. I mean, I was doing things where I was like, oh my God, like I can't believe that I am this close, you know what I mean? And so yeah, it was just really a really great experience.
Well, we're at the hour, so I'm gonna cut off the questions now. I know Jason has to head out. We still will be having a reception across the hall, where we'll just be obviously talking about how great that talk was without Jason being present. So